Okay, so thank you everyone for coming. My name is Lia Tarachansky. I'm an Israeli, Soviet-born Canadian journalist and documentary filmmaker, and I was asked to moderate this event. I'm here on behalf of Independent Jewish Voices, which is an organization here in Canada, which was founded in 2008, and since then it's a group of mostly Jewish activists here in Canada and some of their allies who are working towards ending apartheid in Israel and Palestine. If you want to know more about their work, please check out Independent Jewish Voices online. But the event today specifically was organized by a group of activists associated with Independent Jewish Voices. And I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Stu Goldstein and, of course, Judith Deutsch, who'll be speaking a little bit later, Paul Weinberg and Harold Schuster, and everybody who was involved in making sure that today goes forward and goes ahead as a success. So I'm going to introduce our guest speaker today, after which he will speak for a short time. I will then introduce Judy, our Canadian speaker today. She will speak for a short time, and then I will kick off the Q&A, at which point I will ask a few questions to the panelists to get the conversation rolling and make sure that we're covering the topic of the book. And after that, we will open it up to the greater public. So if you have a question, please don't write it in the chat because it's very easy to miss. Please write it in the Q&A section. So if you look in the bottom of your Zoom window, there should be a button called Q&A. If you click on that, it will give you the option to write in a question. So we encourage you to write us specific questions you want to ask to the panelists that we have here today. I also wanted to say that Judy, myself, and our host today, Stu Goldstein, the three of us are based in Toronto, which of course is Anishinaabe territory. Pre-colonization, there was an agreement that was achieved here with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy called the Dish with One Spoon. For a period of about 200 years, this place also hosted the Huron or Wendat people who later on in the 1600s moved back north. And over the last few centuries, a number of different communities have also made this place their home. And for those of you watching from wherever you are in Canada or the world, so much of our lands are native lands. And it's so important not only to acknowledge that, but to remind ourselves that whether we are fighting colonialism in Israel, Palestine, or here in Canada, we are committing ourselves to destroying the apartheid-like systems that enable the theft of land and the colonization of culture and life. So I hope that you go to nativeland.ca if you don't know specifically on whose lands you're living. It's a wonderful resource and a map outlining the territories, treaties, and languages of the communities of indigenous folks living almost everywhere in North America. So I just want to also, as we kick off this event, remind you that there is so much to talk about when it comes to Israel and Palestine and Canada's connection to endorsing and supporting what's going on in Israel and Palestine. There's so much going on that there's just not enough time to cover absolutely everything. And I just wanted to get us in the mindset of the particular book that we're here to discuss. It's written obviously by Dr. Haim Bresheeth-Zabner, who is not just a professor, currently retired. He's also a filmmaker and a photographer. He's a scholar of film studies as well. And he has been teaching at SOAS, which is a London, England-based school of in the Department of Oriental and African Studies. He's written a number of books on the Gulf War and another one called The New World Order. This particular book, An Army Like No Other, How the Israel Defense Forces Made a Nation, focuses specifically on the early years of the IDF, how the IDF participated in its various wars over those years, with a heavy focus on how it infiltrated the consciousness and the support of the larger Israeli nation becoming a binding kind of glue to Israeli society. So when you're asking questions, I invite you to please focus on either the IDF specifically or militarism in Israel or Canada as the guiding theme of the question that you're asking. Now, every year, the Israel Democracy Institute does a survey of Israel. I really encourage you to go and check it out. It's free online. It's quite a thorough survey. And every single year they find, when they ask Israelis their trust in institutions of the state, the number one thing that Israelis say that they trust 90% almost every year is the Israeli Defense Forces or the Israeli army. And so how that came about, that the political parties of Israel are at the very bottom, the media is at a very low, the police even, the government, the parliament, the Supreme Court, all below the Israeli army. So to help us understand how we got to that point is with us today, Dr. Bresheeth-Zabner. And Haim, I would love for you to unmute yourself and take us away. Haim, you're muted.
Can you hear me?
Great.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to IJV Canada. I myself am one of the co-founders of Jewish Network for Palestine in the UK. And both organizations, the Canadian one and the London-based one, are inspired, I believe, by the same American organization, JVP. We have a sister relationship to both of you. So I feel at home speaking to IJV members. Our political program is very close to both JVP and IJV. And we have now around 1,000 members and associate members. We're a new organization and we're growing fast, not fast enough, but you know that problem. Now, I want to first explain why I wrote this book, because I'm not a military historian. I came to London in 1972 to study. I had no plan of staying in London. I thought I will do my PhD and go back to Israel and teach there, which is what I've done before, and make films. But while I was in London, a war started in the Middle East, and I hesitate to say volunteered because the story is much more complicated, but I ended up fighting in that war in 1973, and it changed me forever. And when I came back to London, I was not the same person that arrived there the year before. And I was already decided that I will never fight and you will never use arms against people. In a short while after that war, I joined Matzpen, the anti-Zionist organization. And it all sounds very simple when you say I joined Matzpen. It sounds like I've done it in 5 minutes or 5 seconds. It took me 3 years to realize that I have joined it. It took me 3 years to realize that I have become an anti-Zionist. Because it's very difficult for an Israeli that grew up like I did to become an anti-Zionist. But once you've gone to the other side, you don't look back. However, I found that in London and in other places that I went to around the world as an academic and as a filmmaker, people were very excited to find that I'm from Israel and told me how much they loved it without actually knowing my position. What a great country it is, and the Israelis are great people. And And some of them even continued the whole racist hog and told me how horrible the Palestinians are, terrorists and the rest of it. I'm sure all of you have experienced this, and it is a difficult experience. And when I spoke to people about my own understanding, which differed from the very simplistic presentation of the conflict, they mostly were disturbed by an Israeli who criticizes Israel so severely. And so I started thinking about ways of explaining Israel to non-Israelis, even to people, Jews and others who like Israel, but actually don't know what it is that they like or should dislike. The level of knowledge and understanding about Israel is surprisingly low for a topic which is actually in the news more than the People's Republic of China. So this is surprising. It's not pleasant. And I thought, what can I do? What lens can I use to explain that Israel is not just another country like the one you visited last summer? And very quickly, I focused on the Israeli army because I thought there is no better way to explain to non-Israelis what Israel is like and what Israelis are like. I live in London, and in London, you tend to understand people by the kind of school they went to and the class background they have emerged from. I'm not saying that I do that, but the society normally does that. This is because it's a very much a class-bound country. I don't think Canada is in the same way. I don't think the United States is in the same way class-bound. These are newer countries with a different background, and Israel is even newer and is not class-bound because there is no history of hundreds of years of classes controlling. There's no controlling classes in the same way. So class and that type of thing that goes with class, you know, family background, private schooling, which ironically is called public schooling, that is not a way to understand Israel. And then a lot of people understand Israel, they think, because they read or visited a kibbutz. Many people, especially progressives, that have gone to Israel, met Israelis, not now, I don't think, but in the past, who were in one of the peace movements and were very influenced by Israelis who, on the face of it, were really great people. They wanted peace. They wanted, you know, two states for two people, or, you know, the two-state solution, as it is called, a solution that never existed and doesn't exist today and cannot exist. And maybe the questions will raise this at the end. So how do you explain Israelis? And how do you explain Israel? Now, I think the best way to explain a culture and a country is through its main experiences. It's sociological experiences, but also psychological experiences, because what is sociologically accurate is in the end psychologically influential. And it's very clear that the main experience that connects Israelis to their identity, or is making up their identity, is the Israeli army. I'm talking, of course, about Israeli Jews. Most Israeli Arabs do not partake in this army because it is an army that sees them as enemies. So they're not welcome to it. They wouldn't want to be in it. But that means they also don't share in the main experience of living as an Israeli. If in England, the public school is where people meet and become part of the elite and come to know each other and form links that will serve them for the rest of their lives, and you know, will help them to get a job, to give people jobs of the same club, if you want. That exact the exact place is in Israel, fulfilled by the Israeli army. This is where different Jewish groups, I call them tribes, and we can go into that later on, meet. It's the only place they meet. It's the only place they negotiate each other. They have relations, and they share each other, but they also share the other me being the Palestinian and the Arab. And this is the place that shapes, forms, changes the way that they understand the world around them, and they live in the Arab world. Israelis live surrounded by Arab countries and also surrounded by Palestinians, as it happens, on all sides, if you want. And to deal with that, in a sense, an island existence. This is how Israelis consider themselves, living in an island, you know, surrounded by enemies. And I don't think this has changed just because some sheikhs in Arabia have signed agreements with some Israeli opposite numbers like Netanyahu. So the relationships to the Arab and specifically to the Palestinian, and we just heard from Leah about the First Nations of the North American continent. The First Nation of Palestine are the Palestinians. And, you know, you can look at me and tell that I am a European, you know. It's very easy to tell that I have not originated in Palestine. And Shlomo Zand, whose many books on the topic I'm sure you have met and read and appreciated, explains this. Shlomo is a very good friend of mine, and we both come from the same part of Jaffa, because we were born in a refugee camp, both of us, in Europe after the Holocaust, and we lived in Jaffa, you know, a few hundred yards from each other, and we have a very similar background, and both of us are of European extraction. In other words, we are Ashkenazi Jews. And even Jews in North Africa are very unlikely to have originated in Palestine. You know, Shlomo is the best place to go to see why. I can't really talk about it today. But basically, the people who originated in Palestine are the Palestinians. And many of them have been, in the past, in the very, very remote past, Hebrews. Ben-Gurion even wrote a book about that. Would you believe it, in a language he hated, which is Yiddish. In 1915, he wrote a book about the Arabs of Palestine, and he explained that they were once the Hebrews, and that's why he wanted, in 1915, to convert them back to Judaism. This position, or this solution, was dropped quite fast after he's written the book. But this is, of course, true. You know, there were lots of Hebrews and others that turned into Christianity when it came, and then turned into Islam when it took over the Middle East. This is what happens with people. They chop and change when the situation changes. So, and Shlomo, of course, also dispels the myth of the exile. So basically, when you want to talk about Israel, you have to talk about the institutions that shaped it. And when I say shaped it, I mean shaped us, me. Millions of Israeli Jews were shaped by those institutions. And when Ben-Gurion comes to create Israel in 1948, he says, and I relate in the book to this, we now have an army, we have a state, but we have no nation. He was right. Nations take sometimes hundreds of years and very complex processes to formulate themselves, to become what we now know them as. And the nations of Europe or the nations of North America, we're talking about this in North America today, took a very long time. And look at America. Look at the United States. United States is not really fully formed as a nation. And we've seen that this week, and how deep the crevices are between the two halves of the so-called nation of North America, the United States. Canada has its own divide, much more peaceful and and one that I can very warmly connect to, being now a European and appreciating both the French and the English side. So this is, creating nations is a very painful, traumatic experience. And as Shlomo says, and of course, many others have said before him, creating a nation depends on forgetting as well as remembering. A lot has to be forgotten before a nation is created. So I chose as a lens, and I want to conclude my introduction to the book with this. I chose as a lens to concentrate on the most important institution, the richest institution, the most powerful institution, and the most influential institution. And as Leah has pointed out at the beginning, the most trusted institution by Israeli Jews, and that is the IDF. You would have thought that the IDF is a really nice institution, but for the fact that we have watched the news for years and we know what it does and what its function is. So I felt that by looking at the IDF, which Ben-Gurion wanted to use as the social machinery for shaping Israeli identity, I could explain it in the most accurate way.
Thank you, Haim. What a wonderful introduction. I can't wait to delve deeper into the book with you. If you guys don't have it yet, if you haven't read it yet, please get a copy of An Army Like No Other, How the Israel Defense Forces Made a Nation. It's available on versobooks.com, and that's an excellent and easy way to avoid Amazon. Coming right up is a short introduction to how the Israeli army, and specifically Israeli apartheid, is endorsed, supported, and enabled by the Canadian government. Because, of course, attached to all of these going in depth ideas about how Israel came to be the apartheid nation that it is, it's also really important to understand what we in Canada, and I understand most of our audience is in Canada, what we in Canada can do about it. I just wanted to share a quick quote. One of the organizers of today's event, Harold Schuster, has at the bottom of his emails, which I find is really beautiful, is by Grace Paley, and it says that the only recognizable feature of hope is action. I also wanted to include, I feel I made a mistake earlier, that Jenny Steinbeck was also one of the main organizers of this event. So thank you, Jenny, for making all of this possible. And now joining us is Judith Deutsch, and she's going to talk about the Canadian angle in terms of how Canada has endorsed and enabled Israelis' apartheid and Israeli army. Judith Deutsch is a psychologist, but she's also the past president of an organization called Science for Peace. This particular topic, militarism and Israel, she has researched extensively over the years with also independent Jewish voices. And she also researched many other topics that intersect with it, such as nuclear armament, and of course, the impact on children. And the intersection of climate change and militarism. She's published a number of articles on the topic. I invite you to go check out Now Magazine, Canadian Dimension Magazine, and Counterpunch to read her articles. And most relevantly, her article, The Exploitation of Children, was one of the keynote papers presented at the Gaza Community Health Program, which was part of 2008 symposium by the World Health Organization entitled Building Bridges. So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself, and Haim and Judy, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Thank you. Thank you very much. And again, my welcome to everybody who's participating in this. And it's terrific that we're focusing on this, and that Haim has written this really such an important book. I've, as Leah said, I've been concerned about this for a long time. This goes, at least I would say a decade ago, that Jeff Halper was here. He's written also quite brilliantly about Israel's weapons, and he recommended that a key focus for our work, would be to reframe and to really understand Israel in a much more realistic way, not as, a victim or the lone democracy in a sea of Arab hatred and so on. But, for various complex reasons, the whole issue of Israel and the military and all the things that are connected with it have really been sidestepped. And I think Haim and both Leah, imply that, that it's for various reasons, it's been hard to shift the perception. There's much to say about these topics. So again, I'll have to be highly selective here. But I will start by talking about the collusion and the silence at all levels of the Canadian government, federal, provincial, city, the readiness to defend Israel and to vilify critics of Israel. And I think the other thing is that many NGOs and academics also here in Canada participate, maybe not in such an extreme way, but by underestimating, I think, what happens in Israel and Israel's influence in Canada and globally. So I hope I will talk about Canada, but I would hope also to be able to talk about a global context too. One of the things that Haim does so helpfully in his book is to go over, as a fine historian, the many historical periods that have so interacted with the evolution of what has happened, really, I think, globally. That in Israel there was a group, certainly of Zionism, Zionists, who had a single-minded intention of how they wanted the state to evolve, and how they wanted to form a nation, not just a state, but a nation. And that went through, what he does is he traces that through many historical periods. you know, from the late 19th century imperialism, the world wars, and the Cold War, post-Cold War eras. So I think when I talk about Canada now, I'm talking about a specific historical period of a very rapid shift in quite dramatic ways, shifting alliances, shifting crises, you know, and both Canada and Israel, you know, partake in it, both causally as well as in terms of the effects. It's I find it a very tragic era, this period of what I think of as neo-fascism, the COVID emergency, the climate catastrophe, and what I think of as metastatic neoliberalism. So it's that context that I'm talking about. And I'll give some examples in terms of Canada's relationships with Israel. In view of this horrible, all these horrible forces, on the other side is the public. IJV did a survey of public opinions. It was much more realistic, much more understanding and insightful, not equating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. There's also the quotes from Richard Falk, who was a former special rapporteur on human rights in the occupied territories, Ali Abu Nima, who feel that in the court of public opinion, that the forces of evil are not being adopted, that there's much more public awareness and sympathy with the Palestinian plight as well as the plight of people all over the world. And then the very nice quote by Arundhati Roy speaks to that too, when she said that another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. So briefly, I'm talking quickly because there's so much to say. On an international level, I think Canada's position has been really, really shameful. And it also speaks to, I think, a kind of liberalism blindness. Canada was the only, in 2009, Cass led was Canada was sitting on the UN Human Rights Council, was the only country to oppose calling for a ceasefire, you know, during that massacre. And I think that subsequently that was the reason that Canada has consistently lost its place in, you know, in terms of being appointed to the UN Security Council. Canada has consistently supported and not criticized Israel's really overwhelming attacks on Gaza, claiming that Israel all the time has a right to defend itself. In 2006, Stephen Harper, as you might remember, and I'm talking about this kind of as a cultural, psychological aspect, that Stephen Harper said that Israel's, you know, killing of a Canadian family fleeing Lebanon and that horrible slaughter, he said that Israel's, that was a measured response. Michael Ignatieff, in response, he was the leader of the Liberal Party, you know, said that he doesn't lose sleep over these atrocities. So this is, you know, again, like a bizarre, to me, incomprehensible way of treating these blatantly awful things. Canada was against, had kind of a knee-jerk reaction to at an international level to criticisms, challenges to Israel. It was one of the only countries that voted against adoption of the Goldstone report. At present, the Trudeau government has opposed, on principle, the International Criminal Court investigation of Israel war crimes against Palestinians. So there's there's this kind of consistent record of these positions taken by Canada. There's a number of agreements and joint efforts with Israel, between Canada and Israel. There's security agreements, there's trade agreements. Israel is on the safe country export list, so automatically Canada can export weapons to Israel. There's a lot of collaboration in terms of manufacture of weapons components for Israel's weapon systems. There's pension plan investments in these weapon systems. There's joint police training. Both Canada, this period has been in some ways called a new Cold War, with one of the alignments is of course the NATO countries, which Israel is a non-official member of NATO, that none of these countries, one thing is that they have, joint military exercises up until 2018. They were in Alberta, at Cold Lake, Alberta. Another aspect of this new Cold War is that none of the NATO countries have participated, much less approved, but even participated in the formation, the construction, the negotiations around the nuclear ban treaty. And of course, none of them, at this point will sign it. The ban treaty, which has come into force because the sufficient number of countries have signed onto the treaty. There's silence that Canada and the NATO countries have participated in, colluded in since the 1950s in the silence about Israel's nuclear weapons. There's the absurdity of Israel not signing the non-proliferation treaty, and yet Canada, the UN, many NGOs, including some in Canada, have convened several meetings. One had to be postponed because of COVID, but meetings in the Middle East on creating a Middle East nuclear-free zone. And it's so like theater of the absurd that Israel is not included in the meeting, so they want to create a nuclear-free zone without including the only country in the Middle East that does have nuclear weapons. Canada has participated in the charade, in a way, of Iran being a threat, imposing sanctions on Iran. Israel has been very pivotal in that kind of construction of the world situation. Israel's nuclear weapons are targeted at Iran. Israel's modus operandi of in war situations is to very quietly, surreptitiously provoke a response. So this is what they've done repeatedly in Gaza, killing key people. Now that they've killed nuclear scientists in Iran, but it's provoking a country or people to respond finally to these attacks, and then to launch a full-scale attack. So Israel appears to be doing that with Iran, but Canada, Israel, and of course the NATO countries have with Trump, have pushed for sanctions against Iran, and the attempt to undermine the nuclear joint cooperation agreement there. So there's these underreported kinds of under the radar ways of collaborating with this very militarized Manichaean view of the world that underlies tremendous amount of weapons proliferation. Israel, interestingly, has, even in the last year, with such a cut down in industrial production, Israel's arms sales have increased by 77%. Canada's arms increases have been, let's see, 30, I have it written down here, 33%. Canada's exports have increased. And its major exports are to the UK and to Israel, and of course to Saudi Arabia. The US arms exports have increased by 23%, and Russia's exports have decreased by 18%. So you have Israel and Canada being amongst the highest arms exporters, arms suppliers. I think I mean, there's much to mention in terms of the joint police training. Canada, I'd like to mention had this Operation Proteus, which involved the training of Palestinian Authority police, which certainly saved Israel a lot of money in terms of controlling so-called Palestinian terrorists. Operation Proteus, the PA police were trained to protect settlers, but not to protect Palestinians. So Canada was involved in training thousands of PA police in Operation Proteus. Are you still hearing me? My screen has frozen. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, I'll just let. I'm sure that my time is closing, but I wanted to mention another fascinating cultural aspect that speaks to, again, a kind of a knee-jerk reaction, an unquestioning reaction on the part of the various political parties in Canada. Right after Operation Protective Edge, a certified war criminal, Shaul Mofaz, was allowed into Canada to speak at a JNF, Jewish National Fund fundraiser event, which was also involved with the recruiting, the recruiting of soldiers in Canada to go and serve in the IDF. Shaul Mofaz was allowed into Canada. However, around that time, that Colonel Ann Wright from the U.S., who was a proponent of BDS, was not allowed at that time in Canada, nor was George Galloway, who had contributed some humanitarian aid to Hamas. And so Shaul Mofaz was here at a synagogue. Me and a small group of people went to protest. And at that event, a film was shown of the parliamentary delegation that went to Israel during Operation Protective Edge, that did include people from the Liberal and Conservative parties here, including my MP, in which they kind of very proudly talked about the donation of play equipment for Jewish children so that they wouldn't suffer too much, during this massacre in Gaza. And there was not one mention of what was happening to the children of Gaza at that time, in which up to like 550 children in Gaza were killed and one Israeli child was killed. And there's never been any kind of comment about that. So this is really such an awful reflection of people just being invisible, just such incredible heartlessness and moral depravity, I think, and spinelessness here. So anyway, there's much that I can talk about, but that hopefully gives a flavor of.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Judy. We will keep that in mind when we open up the Q&A for the public. Now, going back to the book and Haim. You know, in Israel, there is a kind of understanding that the IDF is the people's army. Oftentimes we call soldiers our boys, even though, of course, women also serve, forced conscription for both. The understanding is that the army is seen not so much as an aggressive force, the way that, of course, its victims see it, but it's seen as this, as you said, kind of like this this camp or this place that we send our kids, this school, and they get trained there and they get disciplined and they do what they have to do for the country and so on. There was a very interesting incident in 2006, and when I say interesting, I of course mean tragic, where a very public incident took place. An Israeli soldier called Elor Azaria came up to an unarmed Palestinian assailant in Hebron, who was already disarmed and was lying wounded on the ground. And he came up to him and he shot him in the head. Now, this war crime was actually filmed by a camera person for B'Tselem, which is a human rights organization. And so Azaria actually had to be prosecuted. Now, when he shot Abdel Fattah al-Sharif in the head, he did that, what you see on camera, he did that as a kind of matter of course. And the prosecution of the soldier raised huge support for the soldier in the Israeli public. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that this case was filmed, because of course, Yesh Din and many other human rights organizations show that about 91% of incidents where a soldier commits a war crime lead to no indictment of any kind. And 80% of these incidents don't even get investigated. So even though Elor Azaria was eventually charged and ended up serving about 8 months, which of course is nothing, he became a national hero in Israel. He became the face of quote unquote our boys. And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit, Haim, about this perception of soldiers in the Israeli army, in the Israeli public. And of course, a lot has changed over the decades, but you write about in your book about how we have come to that place where a war criminal is essentially perceived as a hero of the people. And you're muted. There we go.
This is a very important topic that bothered me both as a researcher, but as a human being. The question we should ask ourselves is this: how do you train people who are totally normal to all intents and purposes so that they become murderers? Brecht has written a very, very beautiful play about this in 1927 called A Man is a Man. And I always loved that play. And I wanted to know, how do you actually do it? Of course, it was done to me. It was done to all Israelis. How do you actually kill thousands of people in a week or two? None of those murderers are ever prosecuted. They are actually held up as poster boys, as heroes. They are our boys. And a 20-year-old or an older soldier who kills someone in cold blood, someone, I mean, a baby, a man, a woman, I mean, these people are just civilians. They just live in Gaza. They have the misfortune to live in Gaza. They have the misfortune to be Palestinian. So how do you actually get people trained to such a degree that they kill people like that in huge numbers and don't think twice about it? And not only that, behind them, there are 6.5 million Jews, an interesting number, isn't it? And those 6.5 million Jews think the world about those murderers and justify them and never question this, apart from a very, very tiny group of people, like, Shovrim Shtika, breaking the silence. These are soldiers that have decided to speak, and I'm sure you know about them. But you also know how rare this is and how difficult their life are made after they start speaking and breaking that silence. So if you look at how this is done, a Canadian going to the Royal Mounted Police or to an army unit is starting to train when they, I believe, they started training when they joined the group. Israelis start their military training in preschool. This is what is so terrifying about the preparation of a soldier citizen. Because I think Leah mentioned that, the army is very popular and the soldiers are very popular. Israel is a democratic country for Jews. We should never forget that. Because it's a democratic country, people do what they want. They're not forced into killing Palestinians. If they were, it would have been, preferable in a sense. They don't want to kill them, but they're made to kill them. No, that's not the case. Israel is a Jewish democracy. In other words, it's the democracy for Jews only. Now, of course, if it's a democracy for Jews only, to kill non-Jews is in a sense to kill non-people. And we know that from Nazi Germany and other regimes, that when you dehumanize, and my whole family was killed in the Holocaust. Both my parents are the only survivors of their families. So when Jews were killed, it wasn't like killing people for Nazi Germans or for the people who helped them from other nations, and there were many. It was killing Untermenschen. Yeah, these were not mentioned, they were Untermenschen. So I think in a similar way, a system of education, it's painful to call this education, but the education system in Israel, and Professor Nurit El-Hanan has done enormous work on the training of children into soldiers. Please look at her work. It's all published in English. And if you start in the kindergarten, by the time somebody comes to the army, they are already ideologically prepared to do the terrible things that the IDF is doing. So this is, the first thing is to understand that, and I know that as I experienced this as a child, and Leah must have experienced the same. We grew through a system that trained us to hate, to deny, to basically not treat Arabs and especially Palestinians as full human beings, as people with rights, as people like us. And therefore it's easier, I'm not saying it's easy, but it's easier to kill them.
And of course,
sorry, I didn't hear that.
Demonization through avoidance, the lack of information about who Palestinians are, what their history is, and how we come to be in this situation. And I wanted to also, I found it very interesting in your book that you don't really deal with questions of gender. And of course, that there's such a huge difference between the conscription of men and women in the Israeli Defense Forces. Here I'm sharing an image of, which is on the head banner of the Israeli Defense Forces Twitter. And we can see here this soldiers kind of going up a hill the struggle of the soldier in this difficult desert, you know, the landscape, the whole imagery of this banner is a par excellence example of settler colonialism in Israel. But of course, that's not the experience of female soldiers. I'm not just talking about the fact that there's an enormous level of sexual assault in the Israeli army. For example, about a decade ago, the Israeli army itself did a research of sexual assault, and it found that about over 80% of female soldiers self-reported that they've been sexually assaulted, but less than a quarter actually said that they understood that that's not normal, that's not something that's supposed to happen. Also, you know, there's a hypersexualization of female soldiers and the use of the IDF of the female soldiers as a kind of marketing tool to sell the IDF. But even more than that, the IDF has become a kind of frontline for feminist struggle in Israel, where getting female soldiers into more and more combat roles is seen as a move towards equalizing the experience of men and women. And I was wondering if we can talk about that angle of the IDF.
Sure. Actually, I do deal with those issues, but briefly in one of the last chapters of the book, because they are important. I had a chapter on this, but the publisher thought the book is too long, so 2 chapters were cut. And you can imagine what's getting cut, the chapter on women. You know, this is a really sad situation when feminists are actually Jewish feminists in Israel are spending their time, energy, and commitment in fighting for their right to kill, to have the same rights as men. This is one place where I say, you know, let the women be out of it. Let both men and women be out of it, of course. But the struggle of a lot of Jewish feminists is not to stand up and understand what it is to be a woman in Palestine whose family is in jail or dead, who has to live in Gaza in conditions that are inhuman, who hasn't got you know, any way of knowing that she or her family will be alive next week or next month. This is not what worries the feminist, you know, the institutions of Jewish women in Israel. This is very sad. And this was quite different. I mean, there were organizations before that were actually standing against the occupation as women, you know, women in black. That I made a film about in, you know, like 30 years ago, that were an inspiring group of women that as feminists stood against the Israeli army and what it has been doing. This is unfortunately a thing of the past. And now the feminist struggles concentrate, as you said, about the right to fight, the right to join fighting units. I don't think that I need to persuade you that this is something quite unhealthy. But the point is, because Israeli women are actually inculcated into admiring and supporting the males who are our boys, our fathers, our brothers, etc., that go to fight, that go to protect us supposedly by killing Palestinian children and women and so on, then the right to join the boys is an important right, supposedly. And this is why they're fighting for it. If you said to them what we are now discussing, if you actually expose the kind of mad bias behind this, you know, quite untypical to feminists anywhere, then they would be very surprised and wouldn't understand what you are saying, not because they are deprived of intelligence, of course not, but because their experience of looking at Palestinians as Untermenschen is so important. And that is the problem. The problem is that when social training of settler colonials is going on for so many years before they even joined the army, by the time they join the army, they're finished. They're finished in many ways, but they are also finished because they've been to the finishing school of settler colonialism, if you want.
Yeah.
And they're done,
Right.
you know. And
Yeah.
I was actually very reluctant to join the army when I was 18, because I understood that this is wrong. But I did, because I wasn't courageous enough to stand up and say, chuck me into jail because I won't join this army, because I don't want to do it.
Right.
I can say this now, and I said it after I changed, but at the time, I wasn't courageous enough to say, no, I will not serve. But I tell in the book, in the introduction, about my father, who in 1948, when I was a baby and we came from Italy to Israel, refused to fight. And they chucked him into jail, and he didn't see me and my mother for months. And in the end, they forced him to serve as a medic because he refused to carry a gun. So, and I didn't know that. I had no idea that he was one of the first people who refused to serve, because by the time I could be told that, he was ashamed that he refused to serve. You see, he turned into an Israeli.
Right.
He was Jewish, and he was turned into an Israeli.
Sure.
These things are very, very important to understand.
Yeah.
And of course, you can see now
Yeah,
that there
and
are
this year,
other young people who are refusing to serve, not enough of them. I wish this would become a very popular move. I'm not too hopeful about that, unfortunately.
Yeah, and you know, the Sheministim started out in the late 90s. Sheministim is Hebrew for grade 12 students, and they started to mobilize other grade 12 students to refuse serving in the Israeli army. And I'm really glad to say that this year there's 60 students that refuse. But as you said, of course, it's not nearly enough to stop the system. And speaking of the system of militarized apartheid, you know, one of the greatest talking points of pro-Zionist speakers is that Israel has the most moral army in the world. And, you know, before 1948, before the IDF, before all the different militias were formed into the Israeli army, there was a range of militias in Israel, including those that are seen as legitimate, using legitimate forms of violence, and those seen as using illegitimate forms of violence. For example, Lehi. And I was wondering, you know, in your book, you talk about how that came to be, how the amalgamation of the various militias into a single army legitimized all of its violence. So I was wondering if you can very briefly talk to our audience today about this amalgamation and how it made the violence of Israeli militias legitimate.
You know, we have to realize that this process starts a long way before 1948. I think the main point of change, the transformation from settler colonialism with occasional violence to settler colonialism with systemic violence is in the 30s. The 30s are a very complex period, because this is when you know, a lot of Jews run away from anti-Semitism in Central Europe under the Nazis and their you know, colleagues in other countries, and they inflate the number of Jews in Palestine from 11% to 33%. 3 times a growth of, you know, 200%. And this is without precedent, you know, really is without precedent. A community of settler colonials growing so fast within few years. Now that meant that the Palestinians saw that they are losing Palestine and started what was a peaceful campaign of a general strike. And the British that always were behind the Zionist project, if you wish, and enabled it and made it possible and successful, attacked those Palestinians in their villages and towns. But they were unable to defeat them because those people with 19th century guns were real fighters, and they fought for their land, and they believed they must protect it from the settlers and from the British. And the only way the British could defeat them is that tens of thousands of Jewish volunteers have joined the British forces, and they got their military training there, and they got their training in violence as well. And actually, the violence of the British was so awful, especially of a special unit called the Special Night Squad, SNS, which operated for a whole number of years, including the war, that some of the more violent people in the Jewish ranks complained about the violence of their commanders, like Ord Wingate. So this is where, you know, not just military experience was shared by tens of thousands of Jews, but also the violence towards villages. For example, the process of decimation was actually taking part. Wingate really liked that, getting into a village, standing all the men in a line, and then shooting dead every 10th man, hence decimation, yeah? And this was a way of saying to the Arab villagers, either you give us what we want, or you're dead. And if this didn't work, they did a second round and then shot again every 10th man. So, you know, some Jews even complained about that. But I'm telling you the story, which in the book is you know, described in detail, because before 1948 already, it is the British that actually trained those units, both the Haganah and the other smaller ones, the Etzel and the Irgun and Sterngang, in very violent and brutal means of breaking the Palestinian resistance. Remember, it took 3 years, 3 whole years for most of the British army, because it was in Palestine, it wasn't in India, that was actually rebelling at the time. More soldiers were necessary to what the British called pacify Palestine, then pacify India. And, you know, they had a problem at the beginning of the war because they had to take a lot of soldiers from Palestine to the European theater. Most of the British army was in Palestine, and even that took 3 years to kill 10,000 Palestinian, you know, volunteers from the villages that fought against them. So, you know, the violence doesn't start in 1948.
Sure.
It starts with being soldiers of a settler colonial project. And of course, a settler colonial project, as you know better than most people in North America, led to the death of tens of millions. Yeah, a settler colonial project is not a cocktail party and cannot be done with smiles and with you know, nice words. It has to use violence.
Of course. Judy, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. I mean, there's so much to talk about. There's also the planfulness of the ethnic cleansing that occurred long before the Holocaust, by the Zionists, where they did very careful research on all of the Palestinian villages and who to select, who to assassinate in a sense. So that's one thing. But going back to people, how do young people get indoctrinated? I also tremendously value the work of Nurit Pele-Lohanan and the educational methods. It's interesting to think about, for instance, the work of the documentary filmmaker Avi Mograbi, who shows this kind of an aspect of the indoctrination, the cultivation of aggressiveness from a much earlier age, from toddlerhood, really, where Israeli children are told by the people that they most trust, that Samson, for instance, was a hero, that it makes aggression, it makes suicide terrorism itself into something very exciting, as they talk about Samson the hero killing 5,000 people, Philistines, in his revenge, his own suicide. So that's one aspect of the psychological part. Another aspect, which is quite, rooted in one of Freud's observations, is around being an exception. That has been a very important factor in Israel. That since we've been such horrible victims, we've been throughout history, such victims, that we're entitled to do whatever we need to do, to save ourselves.
Yeah.
So that, the factor of being an exception is something you address in your book too. So
Thank you for that. Thank you. And again, going back to the book and to the specific topic of the IDF, there's a very important aspect, Haim, that you talk about in the book, and you, in fact, it's the very first lines of the introduction where you introduce your own personal story as survivor of the Holocaust. His parents were survivors of the Holocaust, and your whole family was murdered. And immediately after 1948, the generation that committed the crimes of the Nakba, or let's say fought in the 1948 war, did not speak about what happened in that war from the perspective of the Israeli army, and very quickly was written into Israeli public's consciousness as the founding heroes of the state, those who fought in the War of Liberation, as Israelis call 1948. At the same time, of course, as Israel is now home to a whole generation of Holocaust survivors, there's this kind of dichotomy between the generation that survives the Holocaust and the generation, half of which are the Holocaust survivors, who are this militaristic founders and pioneers of the state. And in fact, it wasn't until the 80s when the Israeli government became very active in building and enshrining the Holocaust into the national consciousness. And so I was wondering if you can talk about how the Sabra myth and the idea of this, the true Israeli is the Israeli who's strong and silent and masculine and lives, in the desert, but then writes poetry at night, that whole myth, how that comes into clash with the reality of the Holocaust survivors. And you talk about growing up in Jadalia, which is obviously a depopulated Palestinian village in Jaffa. And I was wondering if you could talk about, you were really in the middle of the cooking of that soup. So can you talk to us about that aspect of the book?
Well, you see, there are two ways of relating to the Holocaust. One way was the way that my parents chose, and that is to be witnesses for the world about what has happened to them, because they didn't want it to ever happen to anybody else. This was what was more important to a lot of survivors, not enough, but a lot of survivors. And it wasn't easy to speak about it, but when they came to Israel, they found that they couldn't speak to anyone about the Holocaust because nobody wanted to hear. And nobody wanted to hear because the Holocaust was supposedly, when Jews were weak, they went to the slaughter like lambs, lambs to the slaughter became the way to describe the Holocaust survivors as well as the victims. So that they were tarred with the brush of, you know, being not courageous enough to fight the Nazis. Imagine, you know, historians have proven beyond any doubt, and I'm dealing with that in the book, that Jews as a group have fought the Nazis in greater numbers per capita than any other European nation. Now think about that. Think about the fact that Jews didn't have a state, didn't have an army, but they formed themselves into groups of partisans all over Europe to fight the Nazis. They had no chance because not only the Nazis fought them and hunted them as animals, but also the collaborators. But they did that. So to actually treat the people who survived the Holocaust as cowards is doubly disgusting. You know, it really is something that I can't even find the proper, the proper name for, a definition for it. But that was what my parents and others met when they came to Israel. Because in Israel, we had the Sabra. The Sabra is courageous. They are not frightened of anyone. They can take anyone on. They have their Uzi and the tank and the jets and so on. And everyone is frightened of them rather than them being frightened of anyone. Now, of course, all the battles that the IDF fought were, you know, skewed in their favor, just because the Arab armies were very weak, you know, made up of villages that had no motivation, say in Egypt or in Syria. And because they were poor, they ended up in the army. They didn't know what is happening in Palestine, and they came badly trained and were defeated by a very committed and larger and better equipped Jewish army. So in Israel, the idea of the Jews who died in the Holocaust was really disgusting for the Tzabar, the Sabra. You know, weakness, Jewish weakness, this is really awful. And basically, there was a denial of everything to do with the Holocaust until 1961, when the Eichmann Trial, kind of a very big show trial that Ben-Gurion has organized. Read Hannah Arendt about this. Her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, is beautiful. And until then, the survivors of the Holocaust were used basically to justify two things. A, getting a lot of money, more than any other nation has got as war reparations from Germany. And the other, not less important function of the survivors of the Holocaust was Israel was staging itself as the speaker of the Jewish dead, the speaker of the Holocaust dead. And therefore, they are, in a sense, immune and have impunity from any prosecution or accusation of war crimes because they are Jewish, and Jews were treated in this way by the Nazis. So these were the two functions that the Holocaust was used for. But the Jews who survived were treated like the scum of the earth. And we at school were called soaps because, you know, the story was, it wasn't true, of course, that Jews were made into soaps. So children of survivors, and every child in my school was a child of survivors, were called by the proper Israelis soaps.
Yeah, that's horrific.
We were
that's
called,
horrific.
you know, human dust.
That's horrific. I can't
horrific.
even
So,
imagine.
you know, before they fell in love with the Holocaust, they treated those very people who survived basically as cannon fodder
Right.
in 1948, and then as subhumans.
Right. That's horrific. And I can't imagine growing up like that. Obviously my family as well was murdered in the Holocaust. And the experience was so horrific for those who survived, my grandparents, that talking to them about their experience was always seen as something incredibly painful. They could not talk about that. And so I was growing up in Israel, this would have been just before they started to use the Holocaust as a political tool. That silence continued to prevail in the sense. It was very theoretical, the way that we were taught about the Holocaust. On the one hand, there was a hyper focus on the imagery of the violence, the images of people reduced to skeletons. As you were talking about your mom and dad being reduced to something like 34, 32 kilograms. Those images were very strong, but how, the fascism rose to its power in Europe, how Jews were taken outside of the law, all the things that led to that, and the experience in the camps, and of course, what happened to the survivors. None of that was discussed. And so there's this real evolution in Israel in terms of understanding its own position, understanding its own society, trying to form its own identity as a nation. And, I find a lot of activists that they come to Israel and they've read all of the books, they've memorized all the statistics, and they have this very clear understanding of who's right and who's wrong, and very kind of soccer politics in terms of this is my team, this is not my team, understanding of a very complex society. And when they come to Israel and they see that Israel is actually now a modern state with a complex, very mixed society. Of course, we're talking about not just European Jews that live in Israel. Almost half the population are not from Europe, descendants of people that came from North Africa and the Middle East, and have had a very different experience of life in Israel, not to mention the Soviet Jews that came out of a state just like I did, that essentially perpetuated the same kind of anti-Semitism that the Nazis had created. So there's a very complex society there, and how that society evolved is not a simple thing. And so I think that for me, what was really eye-opening in your book was, most scholars of militarism in Israel. And by the way, I wanted to mention that there is an excellent book, unfortunately only available right now in Hebrew, by a Tel Aviv University professor called Hagit Gur, and it talks about militarism in Israel. It's called Militarism in Education. So if you do read Hebrew, please read it. It's an excellent book. Of course, many Israeli feminists have dealt with militarism. But going back to what I was trying to say, in your book, most people who deal with militarism, they deal with 2 or 3 events. They deal with 1948 as the transformation of the population. 2/3 of Palestinians are ethnically cleansed. They deal with 1967 as a euphoric event where in 6 days, the territory under control of the Israeli government triples and occupied the West Bank, Sinai, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights get occupied. And maybe they talk about 1973, the war that you fought in, which was lost. There's a very big myth that was a big surprise. But of course, when you study what actually happened, you realize that much of the government was aware of what was going to happen. In any case, 1973 and that loss being a devastation to that euphoria. And since then, there's been a kind of besieged attitude to the Israeli army. And what I found was so fascinating in your book is that you focused so much not on those 3 dates, which of course you did talk about, but on 1982, the war with Lebanon. And I think that you are exactly right. I think that you touched on something incredibly important, because 1982, the war with Lebanon, the beginning of the war with Lebanon that goes from 1982, you can argue that never ended, but of course the occupation of Lebanon withdrew in 2000. That was a big change in the Israeli consciousness, because it was the very first war that there was a peace movement that was protesting it as the soldiers were actually in Lebanon. And the peace movement that we know in Israel that blew up into something enormous in the 90s, and before we talk about the collapse of it, really started with that moment. And I was wondering if you can elaborate for our audience who hasn't had a chance to read the book yet, about how 1982 was a foundational turning point in the Israeli society.
I think this is a very important question. And I spent a lot of the book and a lot of my energy on 1982 and 2006, the two wars in Lebanon. Because in 1973, Israel fights an army for the last time. I'm saying the last time because it's very unlikely that it will fight another Arab army in our lifetime, not just in my lifetime, which is probably not that long, but in your lifetime. It's very unlikely. But what has happened is that the war has turned from a war between armies and states to a war of a settler colonial project fighting the populations, the civilian populations around it, both the indigenous population of Palestine and the indigenous population of Lebanon, and in some other cases, other populations. So what has happened is that this became the new project of the IDF. And this project is very lucrative as I go into it in the book. It has made Israel into the number 4 or 5, and sometimes number 6 exporter of military hardware, software, and training. When you remember that this is all done by 6.5 million Jews, and for most of the period, the number is even smaller, it is rather striking and very unlikely. You know, this is a very small country without coal, without steel, without the usual, you know, required, you know, materials of a heavy industry that produces tanks and the rest of it, and armaments. And this little country is in a leading position. It is training, you know, police in North America. And, you know, that training was evident during the Black Lives Matter, you know, demonstrations. I am afraid it wasn't evident this last week in Washington, because the people there were whites, and therefore we don't do that to whites. But, you know, if there were non-whites, we know what will happen. And this training is based on the racist aptitude and that Israel has developed towards the Palestinians. So imagine there are 6.5 million Palestinians and 6.5 million Israeli Jews in Palestine. Mm-hmm. And there is only one state between the river and the sea. There are no two states. There never have been two states between the river and the sea. And, you know, these numbers are striking. It's the same number. Slightly more Palestinians by about 150, 200,000. I go into the book, I go to, in the book into this battle of numbers between the two communities. Basically, these are the enemies. The enemies are not in tanks. The enemies don't have jets. They don't ride, you know, they don't operate drones. The enemy are children and women and men and old men and sick men, you know. The enemy are the people, the people of Lebanon, the people of Palestine. And so the army is becoming a very different machinery than it was when it was fought armies. You know, it doesn't need now to fight armies. It needs to fight people and to fight small groups. You know, the whole of Hezbollah is less than a division in Israeli terms, and Israel has got something like 20 divisions. So, and yet, both in 1982 and in 2006, the Israelis did not win in Lebanon. Yeah, this makes you think. And what does it make us think about? 1936 to 1939 in Palestine, when the Palestinians fought the British, a modern army of an empire, and almost won. So yes, the army is very powerful, is very violent, is very brutal, but not only, it rarely wins. This is very important to understand, that in 1982 and in 2006 and in all the attacks on Gaza, they have not achieved their own self-defined aims.
Yeah.
I think this is a sobering thought.
Huge, yeah. And I just had one last point that I wanted to touch on before we go to the audience questions. And by the way, thank you to the audience for all of your wonderful questions. I've been integrating aspects of some of the questions into this discussion, and we will get to specific questions in just one moment. But one thing I wanted to touch on is exactly what Haim, you just mentioned, which is that the Israeli army has now transformed. The collapse of the peace process in 2000 with the Second Intifada, the collapse of the peace movement in the Second Intifada, and the collapse of the peace process in recent years has led to a widespread apathy in Israel. And for example, a quarter of Israeli young people under 25 would move out of Israel if they could find a country that would give them citizenship or a way to live there. And when you look at the larger population, there's a widespread lack of faith, not just in the Israeli democracy, which is losing faith from year to year, but also in the possibility of a good future in Israel. And so this kind of apathy, of course, spreads to everything, including the sense of national pride, of national unity. And we've seen that the number of people who actually go and fight is plummeting. And if you actually include all of the religious Orthodox who get an exemption from the army, people who claim that they have mental issues in order to not serve, people who actually have mental issues, and all of the people who actually do not serve, you find that only about half of the Israeli citizens serve in the Israeli army. And the zeal, the pride of going to the army that your generation had, Haim, doesn't exist in my generation. The army is seen as a burden, this thing that we have to do. We don't have a choice not to do. And if we refuse to do out of conscientious objection, could land you in jail. And of course, many of my friends have done that jail time, so I know it's possible. But what I'm trying to get at is this kind of apathy, this lack of national pride means that you don't have a generation of young people running to serve. And the enemy, as you say, has also transformed, and Israel is no longer an army that fights these international wars. It's largely an occupying force that administers an occupation. And because Israel is a high-tech nation that has such a strong high-tech economy, it has professionalized and technologized that army to the point where we're now seeing a huge rise in privatization of the military service. For example, the checkpoints are privatized. A lot of the control over the Palestinian population is automated. And we're seeing that highly changes the way that not only what the army does, but also the need for a large number of soldiers, and of course, the place of the Israeli army in Israeli society. So I was wondering if you could talk about how this plummeting of, the desire to conscribe in the army, to go for your draft order, and the parallel privatization of the Israeli occupation, how that impacts Israeli militarism.
I think you're raising a very important point, Leah. There are two processes that are actually working against each other, one of which you described. That is the lessening of the commitment of most of, I would say, the middle class in Israel to the values of the army. The values of the army are really murderous, of course. And not only the values, but the practices. So a lot of people who have, world education, as middle-class people elsewhere has, have. Of course, find, you know, going to the army an anathema. And there are less and less of them going to the army. But at the same time, the other layer of society, you know, the Mizrahi Jews, the Black Jews, have no such choice because they come from the lower echelons. And they have to go to the army, and they do go to the army. And also, of course, the settlements. The settlers are for very obvious reasons. The settler families are ideological, many of them, most of them, I would say, and they educate their men and women to go into the army. So the profile of officers in the army over the last 30 years or 40 years have changed dramatically. In the past, they came from the kibbutzim and the left-wing elite that used to exist in Israel. And I'm saying left-wing, but they were never left-wing in the sense that I understand left-wing in Britain or in Europe. And that is a socialist, internationalist, anti-racist movement that is fighting for democracy and equality for all. These were not leftists of that nature. They were Jewish leftists that wanted a Jewish democracy and Jewish socialism. Their socialism never included Arabs and Palestinians and or equality. Nonetheless, they had values which were progressive. Now they are no longer the backbone of the army. The backbone of the army are the religious, the national religious people, and the settlers and the Mizrahis. So now there is, and I'm talking in the book about those tribes that divide Israel, and the only place that they meet is the IDF. You know, Mizrahis don't meet Ashkenazis daily, and they don't live in the same places. And despite the fact there is a lot of mixture by marriage and the rest of it, the real place that they come together is in the army. So the army is now very different. It is much more religious. It is much more a settlers' army. Its function is really to protect the settlers, which the army in the 50s, you know, was different. So these processes go on at the same time. At the same time that some of the more educated middle-class people try to get out of the army, the lower echelons of the social structures are either forced in or even volunteer to fighting units because they actually believe in those values. So I think what you were trying to do is right, but you were, you know, dealing only with one half of the formulation, one half of the social process, and the other half is as important. And those settlers and ultra-religious use the Bible, use religion in order to justify racist behavior and tenets, racist tenets and racist attacks as well. So if, for example, in my childhood, it was impossible to even consider that Jews will have a pogrom of Arabs. You know, the word pogrom was, you know, when Jews were attacked you know, by anti-Semites. Now there are daily pogroms of religious Jews attacking Palestinians. Now, this is a measure of what society has become. The same society that makes the army, that is shaped by the army. There are these relationships which are very strong between the army and those marauding groups of young boys that attack Palestinians, burn the trees. Now, burning trees please.
Right.
You know, I'm
Yeah,
not
of
even
course.
talking about climate change. I'm talking about the Bible.
Right.
In the Bible, it says, is the tree a man that you attack it? האדם הוא עץ השדה, כי תצא עליו למלחמה. This is the Bible saying you don't attack trees. This is something that is impossible to even condone or think about. And this is what they are doing. They are burning millions of trees every year, and the Palestinians keep seeding and planting the trees. Now, think which side you're on in this process.
That's an excellent way to put that. And of course, we are here in Canada, and we've had Judith Deutsch talk a little bit earlier about Canada's support for the Israeli army and for Israeli militarism, not just this unofficial violence. You know, we've come here today. I wanted to say thank you to everyone whose questions have been integrated in the conversation. Coming up, we have an anonymous question I wanted to talk about, but we've also had quite a bit of support, and we see now that Independent Jewish Voices is growing. The surveys that IJV has been doing around Canada have shown a steady increase in the Canadian public's support for justice and peace in Israel, not just something on the surface. And we've actually been, this event today has been endorsed by a whole number of organizations, including Beit Zatun, Canada Boat to Gaza, the Christian Peacemakers Teams, Independent Jewish Anti-Zionist Network Canada, Just Peace Advocates, of course, Science for Peace, Socialist Project, the United Jewish People's Order Canada, the United Jewish People's Order Toronto, and the United Jewish People's Order Winnipeg, which is a very, very important thing. And we have a question from an anonymous audience member who wanted specifically to talk about how we as Canadian activists can help resist Canada's support for the Israeli army. This person is asking Judy specifically to talk about the complaint sent to Justice Minister Lametti on October 19th and the current RCMP investigation in this regard in terms of the recruiting in Canada for the Israeli Defense Forces.
Yeah, there's a petition out through Just Peace Advocates, I think. That's this is really very, you know, again, one of many very important, crucial actions that people could take. I think that there's so many things that we could, you know, that we could address in many different ways, you know, through organizations, through political parties, labor unions, and so on, or just individually. I hope that our group will continue to disseminate this ideas for action and also for information. I want to mention two things in particular, that there's the nuclear ban treaty, which I think is really critical, but also the I don't know, there's so much. One thing I did want to mention, Haim and Leah have talked about the, you know, the mode of Israel's influence in terms of attacking and controlling, strategizing how to control civilian populations, you know, with Gaza being the model, and exporting the weapons strategies and so on. I just wanted to mention border control too, that Canada, you know, any pressure around that, opening borders to refugees, to protesting the horrible conditions all over the world, and certainly, you know, the ICE conditions in the US. Israel has had, this is one of their big niches now, which is, you know, around border control, using their techniques around that. At the end of the Cold War, there were 15 walled borders in the world. Now there are 77, and Israel is the expert on walled borders, surveillance, and all that kind of stuff. So that this is a worldwide trade that it has. This is a huge source of its, you know, for its economy. So, you know, anything, you know, addressing that in terms of the Canadian government is really crucial.
And Judy, if you don't mind talking about the specific asks. So there were 3 asks that the organizing group has put together. And these have to do with what our audience members can do to end Canadian support for Israeli apartheid.
Mm-hmm. Oh, one was around the recruitment to sign that petition and to actively, confront and challenge that recruitment of soldiers here by the IDF. Another was the nuclear ban treaty. That it's just totally unconscionable that Canada has not signed it, and also the incredible silence about Israel's nuclear arsenal and its position, provoking attacks on Iran. What was the third one? I can't remember.
So the specific asks are, 1, to stop the illegal Israeli military recruitment in Canada, as you said, to expose Israel's nuclear weapons and demand that both Canada and Israel sign nuclear ban treaties. And the third one is Samidun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network support for the International Week of Action.
Exactly. Yeah.
Great. And so going back to our audience's question, this is from Nadia Alexan. Just to finish up, Nadia asks, unfortunately, anyone in Canada who dares to question Israeli atrocities is marginalized, accused of being anti-Semitic, and deprived of any public forum. A case in point is that of Linda McQuaig, who was barred from writing for the Toronto Star because she dared to criticize the state of Israel. What can be done about this travesty when people of good will be banned from speaking truth to power? Judy?
Well, I guess there's a couple of things. There's, there's been a big campaign around the attempt to legislate criminalization of criticism of Israel as if it's anti-Semitic. So at municipal, provincial, federal levels, it's really crucial to fight against that. I think the other thing, and this comes from this defiant aspect of myself, is really just to continue to expose these things about Israel and about Canada. Like, how can you say that it's anti-Semitic to expose what our countries are doing? Just to challenge by exposing the truth.
Right.
The facts.
Right. And if our audience would like to know more about Independent Jewish Voices, please check out the Independent Jewish Voices website. A huge thank you, of course, to everyone who organized today's event. Haim, did you want to say some closing words before we close the event?
I would, yes. We talked about the army, we talked about violence, we talked about brutality, about blood spilling in Gaza. I want to talk about the opposite because that is my moving sentiment. What I want to suggest to you is ways of defeating the armies without weapons. I am, an old friend of, and I was one of the 25 people, I think, in London in anti-apartheid movement in the 70s and 80s, and I learned a lot from this. And apartheid in South Africa was defeated without arms, though there was an armed struggle, and it was very important. In the end, it was defeated by hundreds of millions of people that said, no, this shall not continue. And this is what we need to do. And I want to suggest to you, as closing this debate, a way that you can help to do this. In London, we are now organizing not what is normally called interfaith, because this was used by the government as a Zionist, agenda heading, but groups of Muslims, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian organizations, and of no religion, of all religions and none, yeah, and we are calling it Convivencia. It's the Convivencia Alliance. And it reminds people that in the golden period of Spain, Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived together under Muslim rule, indeed, in harmony, in peace, and created the intellectual basis of what we later called, the golden period of Europe, the Renaissance. The Renaissance would be impossible without the Convivencia period that lasted hundreds of years. And this also happened in Palestine. In Palestine, Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived in peace for over 1,000 years. And the only time that this was disturbed was during the Crusades. So we want to come. We are now bringing together Jewish, Christian, and Muslim organizations, not helping Zionism as the government is doing in Britain, but talking about the rights of the Palestinians, talking about the one-state solution, the single democratic secular state for everyone in Palestine, with equality, with human rights, and with social justice. And this has become very successful because who is against democracy, who is against peace, and who is against justice? Not us.
And of course, you wrote this excellent book, which if you haven't read yet, please go to versobooks.com and get a copy. We've had a lot of questions, and I wanted to thank all the folks who raised questions. Esther, Jenny, Chava, Elizabeth, thank you, David, Heap, all of you for your wonderful, wonderful questions. And just to finish up, Paul Weinberg asks, how is your book received in Israel? And I think that that's a very good point to finish on.
Well, my book was not received in Israel. I know because I also have friends in Israel, and I lived in Israel, and I'm an Israeli. I know all the editors of the daily papers and the academic publications, and Verso, the publisher, offered to send all of them copies of the book so that it can be reviewed. Of course, this is totally normal. It doesn't guarantee that this is a good review, of course, but review it, do your best, do your worst,
Right.
But not a single Israeli publication has agreed, even to get the book, not to speak of reviewing it. If you live in a country where 96% support the attacks on Gaza, you don't want this book to review.
Right. Well, that's interesting, considering how many oppositional books do come out every year in Israel. But that's a whole other conversation. I wanted to say a huge thank you to all the organizations that made this event possible, obviously Independent Jewish Voices, but also Beit Zaitun, the Canada Boat to Gaza, the Christian Peacemakers Teams, International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network Canada, Just Peace Activists, Science for Peace, Socialist Project, and the United Jewish People's Order National, Toronto, and Winnipeg chapters. To finish up, Judy, did you have some final words? And just before we switch to you, I just wanted to say, if you missed the beginning of this webinar, or if you want to share it with anyone, we are recording this, and IJV will post on all of its social media as soon as possible how to watch it, and hopefully we'll post this conversation either in audio or video or both.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I guess my final words is that I'm so grateful and relieved that we're able to talk about all of this, and that Haim has written this remarkable book. And again, I would urge everybody, to look at it, to study it. So, and let's all continue.
Thank you.
Work together.
Thank you so much, Judith Deutsch, of course, Haim Bresheeth, the author of the book we're here to discuss. My name is Leah Tarachansky, and I'm a journalist and documentary filmmaker, Israeli and Canadian. And thank you very much, all of you, of course, for joining us today. And on behalf of Independent independent Jewish voices. Onwards and upwards.
Good. Mhm.
Okay.
Leah,
Yes.
John Sharkey is asking if you could repeat the number 3 action item. In the chat.
Absolutely. It's the how about I'll just copy and paste it in the chat.
Mhm.
It is the Samidun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Networks, January 15th to 23rd, International Week of Action to free Ahmed Saadat and all the Palestinian prisoners. So that is the third ask. And Sue, at your leisure, whenever you can, please shut down the event.